Hello, good morning, good afternoon, welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Giles Dickson. Giles is the CEO of WindEurope. WindEurope, as most of you will know, is the leading trade association, the only trade association really for the wind industry in Europe. And Giles is going to be speaking at the Powergrid Leaders Congress on the 12th and 13th of March in the Netherlands, looking obviously at the issues around grid rollout. So welcome, Giles. Thank you for joining me.
Pleasure, Nadim. Pleased to be talking to you.
So the wind industry is obviously now a huge force in the European scene. I think it's a year ago since you overtook coal power in the system, and hopefully in the years ahead we'll see it become the dominant source of electricity in the European grid. And clearly now people are looking at the bottlenecks around the grid. There have been historically bottlenecks with grid deployments, and clearly one of the key areas we're looking to do is to try and, I guess, unlock the midstream, as it were, in the electricity system. So what are some of your initial thoughts around what is currently lacking from a policy environment, or is there other issues that are holding back the development of the grids industry, and what can the grid industry do, as it were, to support the further growth of the wind industry?
Yeah, so wind is now 20% of all the electricity we consume across Europe. And the EU want it to be 35% by 2030. That means building a lot of new wind farms, and we're ready to do that. At the moment, some projects are being held back by the lack of a grid connection. And that is a problem. Grids has become the #1 bottleneck now to the expansion of wind energy in Europe. Now, one of the challenges here is permitting, right? It's too difficult to get permits for your new grid connections. The EU has brought in new rules, which should help. These rules say that new wind and solar and new grid investments have to be treated as a matter of overriding public interest. Now, so far, only a few countries are implementing these rules, but we're seeing where it is being implemented, it's a game changer. So Germany was the first to implement. Now they are permitting 4 times as much new onshore wind as they were 4 years ago. The grid permitting has got a lot easier in Germany. So the message is clear and simple on this. Every government in the EU must, as a matter of urgency, implement these new EU permitting rules, which apply equally to new renewables and to new grid investments. Secondly, we've got to increase how much we are investing in grid infrastructure, both the high voltage transmission networks and also the medium low voltage distribution networks. By the way, wind farms across Europe are connected roughly 50-50 to the transmission networks and the distribution networks. Yeah, the offshore is all to the transmission networks, and the onshore, some of it to the transmission, slightly more of it to the distribution networks. Okay, now, how do we increase investments? We've got to get private money in. There's a lot of private finance out there that wants to invest in grid infrastructure, not least because the grid operators, they're pretty stable companies. They've got strong credit ratings. You know, they all have strong balance sheets. Most of them are still state-owned, at least at the transmission level. Now, crucial thing here is what's the revenue model going to be? Yeah. So fine, you can mobilize your private finance, but that finance will need to be paid back, of course. And somehow governments and regulators and the grid operators have got to sit down and come up with a slightly more creative, flexible revenue model than the very simple one they have today, which is, well, we just put all the capital investments onto consumer electricity bills and they pay everything, and we finance everything through those consumer electricity bills. Now, of course, that will remain to a large extent, but we need to be a little bit more creative than that, okay? There's one other problem, if I can mention it, and that is that a lot of grid operators, they are overwhelmed today with a huge number of grid permit grid connection applications.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're overwhelmed is clogging the whole system up. And this is slowing down the process of giving the grid connections to the projects that actually need and deserve them. I'm afraid there are lots of speculative wind and solar projects that are clogging up the system here. Yeah, because the way it works is, you develop a renewables project, you don't intend to build it, yeah, or operate it. You're just going to sell that project on to another project developer. And if you can get a grid permit, your project is worth more money, so you can sell your project on at a profit, yeah, which is creating this surfeit of often speculative projects that's clogging up the system. And the simple solution to this is in fact, instruct the grid operators to filter and triage their backlog of grid connection applications.
Yeah. And not base it just on time that they can time they applied, but just have some other process to evaluate the I guess the robustness and seriousness of those players.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk about timing. Yeah, today the grid operators, they're all being very dutiful, and they're treating each of these grid applications equally in a strict chronological manner, when it's absolutely clear that some are far more credible than others, some are for projects that are far more strategically important than others and more likely to be delivered than others. And you've got to start filtering and prioritizing those that society actually need.
Yeah. And in terms of just sort of circling back around that sort of creative piece for the regulation that will help unlock private capital, what is there? Have you got something in mind which is an example of that, maybe from other areas or other markets?
Well, it's clear that the private capital wants to invest in grids. Let me give you one example. TenneT, the Dutch-German transmission system operator, issued a bond, a green bond for grid investments recently. It raised in a very short space of time 19 billion euros, and they are now using that, okay? And that is great. They have begun with the regulators to develop a slightly more flexible business model. Yeah. There are other sources of revenue out there in the electricity system through the provision of electricity services that electricity consumers actually want, and it needs some creative thinking here.
Yeah. And in terms of other areas, I mean, we're obviously looking at some of the congestion issues and looking at trying to incentivize greater OPEX-based investments such as dynamic line rating and some of those others. Again, that's just part of the piece around opening up more creative, access to private capital. And I guess is the onus very much on the existing grid operators and obviously the regulatory environment that they operate in? How do you see them as players and partners in the energy transition?
You put your finger on something very important here, Nadeem, which is that the grid operators, their revenue model should be based on total expenditure and not just on capital expenditure. So the OPEX needs to be factored in as well. Okay, that way they will be more incentivized to invest in optimizing the existing grid infrastructure. You mentioned dynamic line rating, great technology. You've also got modular power flow control. Those two technologies will help you get much more electricity into the existing grids, because you'll be able to measure the temperature, see where there's spare capacity, where you could get more electrons in without having to build new lines. Now, of course, we're going to need to build lots of new lines, but at the same time, let's make sure we're using the existing lines efficiently. The UK have done quite a good job on this through the regulator Ofgem, which is incentivizing National Grid now to invest both CapEx and OPEX to make more of the existing grid infrastructure, and other countries should follow that example.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess one final question, and it's obviously an issue that the wind industry has had to confront, and that is NIMBYism, and I guess people not liking the visual impact of obviously wind turbines, but increasingly if we're talking about grid pylons, etc., it's exactly the same issue. Are there any thoughts about how to deal with that? Is it public information campaigns in terms of we have a serious issue in terms of climate change, and we're going to have to I'm going to have to accept increased infrastructure. And what are some of your thoughts around that sort of NIMBYism and communicating to the wider public at large?
You have to engage local communities very effectively indeed. People are generally supportive of the build out of wind energy, and they're generally supportive of the build out of grid infrastructure. If you take onshore wind, opinion polls in all countries across Europe regularly show that 75% of people support having more onshore wind. And in fact, the numbers are even higher when you speak to the people who already live close to an onshore wind farm. And this is really the nub of the issue. Energy infrastructure can bring local economic benefits. Wind farms are all paying taxes to the local municipal governments where those wind farms are located. And that's one reason why communities already living close to a wind farm are even more supportive of wind energy than the national average, because they can see that the local community is benefiting. And you've got to create a positive dynamic there, but that requires close engagement of local communities. The moment you start thinking that you might want to build energy infrastructure somewhere, you go in and start talking to people locally, explain to them what it is you're thinking of doing, listen to them, listen to their concerns, and try and take them on board in the way you fine-tune the investment it is you want to make.
Excellent. Well, Giles, it's been fascinating to talk to you. You're always a great source of insight, and you really obviously have the complete picture of what's going on. So we're looking forward to your input come the 12th and 13th of March, as I mentioned, we're at the Powergrid Leaders event. And we thank you again for all the great work that WindEurope's doing, and we look forward to the continuing growth of the wind industry and getting up towards the 35% mark, which would be fantastic. So many thanks.
Thanks very much, Nadim.